this drawing tip's a bit different, but it's to go back and find an earlier drawing that you've done. Now, this was the first drawing demo I did for a YouTube video. The tip is to redraw the same scene now as a point of comparison as to how your drawing technique, skills, style have developed, and to use that comparison as a basis for what you might choose to do next. Here's the version I redrew about a year ago now. How does it look different to you? For point of comparison, I made a deliberate effort to draw them the same size using a similar sort of pen weight or thickness and in the same sort of style. But the most obvious difference is that I've had a much greater confidence in drawing the more complex elements of ground level. But let's look at them side by side, the two drawings. So now I think some of the differences are a bit more obvious. So this was very helpful for me to see where things had changed and to work out, am I happy with these changes? Is it what I would have thought? And if I'm not, then it may well give me a focus of how I might improve. However, I was also interested to compare this with my most recent drawing, to compare both. This is now 12 months later after my second drawing, and comparing it particularly with my first drawing, I can see what 4 years of constant changes, if you like, following my own advice, what that's caused to how my drawings look. It's a great way to review where we've come and to make plans where we might usefully go. This next tip is really a composition one, and that's when we have a scene that has a significant depth of plane, where there's a good distance between the foreground and the far distance. The closer we can bring something to the very front, we can significantly to increase the depth of plane, to make the background seem even further away by bringing the foreground even closer. And it doesn't really matter what the scene or how deep the depth of plane, whether it's something that is very distant, having things very close really just pushes those mountains even further away and increasing the sense of drama, or bringing these steps right down to the very front does the same thing, even though for a much lesser depth. That sense of really stretching it out as far as we can for this scene in our composition, I think adds a great sense of movement and drama to what we've drawn. I use this next tip when I'm having to do something such as this side wall, and I'm having to work out how far to place it. Now, it's very common doing this sort of thing to draw the corner that's closest to us, then to draw the angled line, work out how far that needs to go, and then to draw the wall. Now, what I find is that this for me is certainly not a very accurate way. I find far better is, instead of measuring down the diagonal, to measure straight across. So firstly, I actually correct the angle, because that's going to help me get it right, and that's a much better estimation of the angle. Did you spot that the angle wasn't sharp enough? And now I look across that gap. I don't go down the diagonal. I find it's very easy to overestimate the width when we go down the diagonal. So going straight across, that's where I think it's going to be. And it's really easy to check, is my estimation accurate? Yep, that estimation is pretty much spot on, and the first one was way too wide. This next tip is easily demonstrated in this drawing. And that's that when we want to create the effect of really bright sunshine, the best way to do that is by controlling our values, our lights and darks, and to have as much contrast as possible, because the sunlight will never look as light as when it's next to darkness that looks really dark. And so we, if necessary, even exaggerate or tweak our shadows, our dark value areas, to create as much contrast between the shadowed and the sunlit areas. We may even do this or create this effect more strongly by minimizing the details that we would perhaps ordinarily have drawn in the sunlight to leave as much paper as possible, to be really controlled, to in effect make our scene as black and white as we can, and particularly the closest shadowed and shaded areas need to be our darkest areas so that we can lighten them slightly as they move backwards to help create a sense of depth. But overall, we want to minimize any ink marks at all in the brightly sunlit areas. So we'll be more dependent on the marks we make of the shadowed parts for creating understanding or meaning of what we're looking at. In this case, the various types of foliage. This next tip is about how when we use the same pen to still work at controlling the weight of our line, how heavy the line appears, and that's got a lot to do with how much we lean or how lightly we press against the paper. So I'm drawing this stump very quickly down in the front right hand corner of our reference, as I often see the stumps or anything drawn for that matter. Now consider where I control my weight of line as I use the same pen to draw the same stump. Now, what am I doing differently and why am I doing it? I'll tell you in a moment, obviously, but can you work out why and how and what the visual impact is? Because it's all about creating a certain effect for how our subject looks. What I've done is my line work for the far side of the stump where the sunlight is coming directly on it is to go very light. In fact, at times, even to have gaps or longer or shorter lines, even just the odd dot in the line work. It creates a much lighter feel, which I think helps convey the fact of all the light that is on that edge, as opposed to the closer side where the shade is more. And so a heavier line reflects the fact there that we've got shade coming down off that edge. It's not that the edge itself has changed, both edges are the same, but the way the light falls differently on different edges does create subtle differences in life. And what I've done is I've tried to use my line technique to reflect those subtle differences in my drawing. This is the way we capture realism more strongly in the things we draw. These sorts of considered intentions. I think this next tip addresses an aspect of drawing that lots of you will have experience with, and that's when our hatching, where we wanted to end on a nice edge sharply, but our hatch lines, while we can line them up at the start, often overshoot where we want them to end. And the very simple answer to this is to use a strip of paper to give us a hard edge on whatever side or sides we want. I very helpfully took the bit of paper out of camera for this next bit, but basically I'm just coming from the other directions, freehand, not using the paper, but just using the paper for this right hand side to get a nice sharp edge. That can really impact the way our drawing looks. And if we do enough lines and they're fine enough, we can actually come back and forth from different directions to get a nice even value, a nice even darkness. Now, here's a drawing where I really wanted a nice sharp edge for where the shade is on that left-hand side, on that corner. So, how did it go? Well, this is how it looked in this case. And I hope you can see how much having that sharp edge to where the shade ends really contributes to the overall crispness of the sunlight. This next tip is to do with how we're thinking when we're drawing trees. Many tree drawings I see end up looking a lot like this. Even where there is some hatching and some attempt to represent the fact that there are different layers in the tree, overall what we end up looking at is much like this. And sorry, I again didn't quite get the alignment of the paper with the camera quite as accurate as I would have liked. But we see something like this. Now I think that's pretty accurately reads as a tree fairly easily. But if we were to look down, straight down from the top, the feeling we get the tree looks is this very, very flattened layer in a very flat shapes, when in fact if we look down on top of the tree, of a tree, we know it's more likely to look more like this, maybe with a section that's hidden underneath. But it's got that roundness, and this is important to realize, especially when we draw from photos that flatten the way trees look. Because the issue is, we need to think when we're standing looking at this three-dimensional round tree, different parts of it are different distances away. It's not like a wall all the same distance, which is how the first tree reads. But there are parts closer to the ground that are closer to us, and parts that are higher up that are further away. So when we draw, we want to get the effect that some parts, these parts for instance, are closer to us, and other parts, such as these parts or the higher parts, are further away from us. If we imagine being in front of all the parts up the top, which weren't in this drawing, further away again. So in fact, we want to imagine this. We want to imagine the tree and ourselves standing in front of it, looking up at it, and just imagine how much further away some parts are from whatever the closest part is. Some branches are going to be coming towards us and maybe quite a lot closer than other parts of the tree. We want to try and capture the feel of that in the marks we make, in the way we control the ink marks going on the paper, to give a sense that some parts are closer and that some parts are further away. Some parts are several times further away than others on the one tree. And particularly if the tree is close or a significant part of the drawing, we want to capture that in some way. Can you see what I'm saying? It's not uncommon, depending on what we draw, to have arches where we have stones facing the arched section, something such as this. Often though, they seem to present problems. Here's a great tip for having arch-facing stones that work every time. The problem is that these blocks of stone that line the arch often end up looking like this. And what we're particularly looking at is the angle of the line between the blocks, where they join each other. Because in fact, they should be like this. They should be able to all be continued into space and join at the one spot. In effect, they should work this way. And if we understand this, we can imagine this happening as we draw those blocks in place, and we can get the right angle between them. So when I'm drawing an archway that has these facing stone blocks as part of its construction, what I need to do is to imagine these lines being continued and all meeting at the same point. I also want to take a little effort to position the blocks so that they're all approximately the same width. And so, while I don't do the best job of that here, it is certainly a skill that we can work at if we're aware of it. And just a few little marks to help give the sense of these stone blocks. A much happier outcome. This tip is regarding drawing palm trees that often end up looking something like this. And the problem is we are so familiar with cartoon palm trees from our youth, and also at times a bit just overwhelmed by the complexity of what a palm tree can look like in life, with this pom-pom of fronds coming at us in 360 degrees. These flat palm trees look like that bottom drawing when we look down on top. Instead of just coming out at right angles to us, these fronds come out from every direction. If we think of them as just wires coming at us, and take the actual leafy parts off, the shaggy parts off the fronds, it's this 360 degree coming towards us and away from us that we're looking at. So rather we have this sort of shape, and now we have to put the palm fronds onto this and draw them. But again, as so often is the case, if we observe carefully and draw what we see, we'll be doing just fine. If we see how some are coming towards us, then we can change the shape according to the angle. We observe it in the reference, we imagine it on the paper, and then we capture that. This next tip is for when we're drawing a scene with a lot of things happening in the foreground, and it's really a drawing strategy tip. And that is, don't be tempted to start with the ground. This often seems to be where people feel the natural starting point is. The problem is that when we first start to draw, if we start with all this ground clutter, we haven't really established a sense of scale, of how large things are in relation to each other. These signs, the garbage bin, the planter, the person here, the person over there, these trees, these street signs, and so forth. I find that it's far more accurate to start with an uncluttered section of our scene, which often is architecture, the architecture that's directly above ground level. Here, I find it's easier to establish a sense of the proportions for the building, and then I'm even more inclined to go upwards and finish this, and that gives me a stronger, more complete reference point now to come downwards. And as I come down, I draw what I can draw without anything in front of it, and then I position the things in front of it as I come to them, always having made sure that I'm stopping drawing before I get to the paper I need for something that's even closer in front. But I now have most of the building that I can use to help me work out the scale and where the ground is going to be and so forth. I find this a far more helpful way of ending up with ground level looking realistic and all the parts in this foreground ground level matching the scale of the background buildings. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope you found these 10 tips helpful. A wider range perhaps than on the other 3 videos I've made so far like this. But in the end, whatever tips you do or don't use, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.